An avalanche of information besets us on what to eat. It comes from the news, from influencers of every ilk, from scientists, from government, and of course from the food companies. Superfoods, ultra-processed foods, how does one find a source to trust and make intelligent choices for both us as individuals and for the society as a whole? A new book helps in this quest, a book entitled Food Intelligence, The Science of How Food Both Nourishes and Harms Us. It is written by two highly credible and thoughtful people who join us today. Julia Belluz is a journalist and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. She reports on medicine, nutrition, and public health. She's been a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT and holds a Master's of Science degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Kevin Hall, trained as a physicist, is best known for pioneering work on nutrition, including research he did as senior investigator and section chief at the National Institutes of Health. His work is highly regarded. He's won awards from the NIH, from the American Society of Nutrition, the Obesity Society, and the American Physiological Society. Julia is joining us from Paris and Kevin from Maryland. Thank you both very much for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
And not only for being with us, but writing such an interesting book. I was really eager to read it, and there's a lot in there that people don't usually come across in their normal journeys through the nutrition world. So, Julia, start off, if you wouldn't mind, telling us what the impetus was for you and Kevin to do this book with everything else that's out there.
Yeah, so there's just, I think, an absolute avalanche of information, as you say, about nutrition and people making claims about how to optimize diet and how best to lose or manage weight. And I think what we both felt was missing from that conversation was a real examination of how do we know what we know and kind of foundational ideas in this space. You hear a lot about how to boost or speed up your metabolism, but people don't know what metabolism is anyway. You hear a lot about how you need to maximize your protein, but what is protein doing in the body and where did that idea come from? And so we were trying to really pare back. And I think this is where Kevin's physics training was so wonderful. We were trying to look at what are these fundamental laws and truths and things that we know about food and nutrition and how it works in us and what can we tell people about them. And as we kind of went through that journey, it very quickly ended up in an argument about the food environment, which I know we're going to get to.
We will. It's really interesting. This idea of how do we know what we know is really fascinating because when you go out there, people kind of tell us what we know, or at least what they think what we know. But very few people go through that journey of how do we get there? And so people can decide on their own, is this a credible form of knowledge that I'm being told to pursue? So, Kevin, what do you mean by food intelligence?
Coming from a completely different background in physics, where even as we learn about, the fundamental laws of physics, it's always in this historical context about how we know what we know and what were the kind of key experiments along the way. And even, with that sort of background, I had almost no idea about what happened to food once we ate it inside our bodies. I only got into this field by a happenstance series of events, which is probably too long to talk about in this podcast, but to get people to have an appreciation from the basic science about what is going on inside our bodies when we eat, what is food made out of, as best as we can understand at this current time, how does our body deal with our food, and with that sort of basic knowledge about how we know what we know, how to not be fooled by these various sound bites that we'll hear from social media influencers telling you that everything that you knew about nutrition is wrong and they've been hiding this one secret from you that's been keeping you sick for so long. But to basically be able to see through those kinds of claims and have a bedrock of knowledge upon which to kind of evaluate those things. That's what we mean by food intelligence.
It makes sense. Now, I'm assuming that food intelligence is sort of psychological and biological at the same time, isn't it? Because there's what you're being told and how do you process that information and make wise choices. But there's also an intelligence the body has and how to deal with the food that it's receiving. And that can get fooled too by different things that are coming at it from different types of foods and stuff. So we'll get to that in a minute. But it's a very interesting concept you have. And wouldn't it be great if we could all make intelligent choices? So Julia mentioned the food environment. So how would you describe the modern food environment and how does it shape the choices we make?
It's almost embarrassing to have this question coming from you because so much of our understanding and thinking about this idea came from you. So thank you for your work. I feel like you should be answering this question. But I think one of the big aha moments I had in the book research was talking to a neuroscientist who said, the problem in and of itself isn't like the brownies and the pizza and the chips. It's the ubiquity of them. It's that they're most of what's available, along with other less nutritious, ultra-processed foods. They're the most accessible, they're the cheapest, they're kind of heavily marketed, they're in our face. And the stuff that we really ought to be eating more of, we all know we ought to be eating more of, the fruits and vegetables, fresh or frozen, the legumes, whole grains, they're the least available, they're the hardest to come by, they're the least accessible, they're the most expensive. And so that, I think, kind of sums up what it means to live in the modern food environment. The deck is stacked against most of us. The least healthy options are the ones that we're inundated by. And to kind of navigate that, you need a lot of resources, wherewithal, a lot of thought, a lot of time. And so I think that's kind of where we came out thinking about it. But if anyone is interested in knowing more, they need to read your book, Food Fight, because I think that's a great encapsulation of where we still are, basically.
Well, Julie, it's nice of you to say that. You reminded me one time I was on a panel and a speaker asked the audience, how many minutes do you live from a Dunkin' Donuts? And people sort of thought about it, and nobody was more than about 5 minutes from a Dunkin' Donuts. And if I think about where I live in North Carolina, a typical place to live, I'm assuming, in America. And boy, within about 5 minutes, 10 minutes from my house, there's so many fast food places. And then if you add to that the gas stations that have foods and the drugstore that has foods, not to mention the supermarkets, it's just a remarkable environment out there. And boy, you have to have kind of iron willpower to not stop and want that food. And then once it hits your body, then all heck breaks loose. It's a crazy, crazy environment, isn't it? So, Kevin, talk to us, if you will, about when this food environment collides with human biology and what happens to normal biological processes that tell us how much we should eat, when we should stop, what we should eat, and things like that.
So I think that is, one of the newer pieces that we're really just getting a handle on some of the science. It's been observed for long periods of time that if you change a rat's food environment, like Tony Sclafani did many, many years ago, that rats aren't trying to maintain their weight. They're not trying to do anything other than eat whatever they feel like. And he was having a hard time getting rats to fatten up on a high-fat diet. And so he gave them this so-called supermarket diet or cafeteria diet composed of mainly human foods, and they gained a ton of weight. And I think, that pointed to the fact that it's not that these rats lacked willpower or something like that they weren't making these conscious choices in the same way that we often think humans are entirely under their conscious control about what we're doing when we make our food choices. And therefore, we criticize people as having weak willpower when they're not able to choose a healthier diet in the face of the food environment. I think the newer piece that we're sort of only beginning to understand is how is it that that food environment and the foods that we eat might be changing this internal symphony of signals that's coming from our guts, from the hormones in our blood to our brains, and the understanding that a food intake, while you might have control over an individual meal and how much you eat in that individual meal, is under biological control. And what are the neural systems and how do they work inside our brains and communicating with our bodies and our environment as a whole to shift the sort of balance point where body weight is being regulated, to try to better understand this really intricate interconnection or interaction between our genes, which are very different between people, and thousands of different genes contributing to determining heritability of body size in a given environment, and how those genes are making us more or less susceptible to these differences in the food environment, and what's the underlying biology. I'd be lying to say that we have that worked out. I think we're really beginning to understand that, but I hope what the book can give people is an appreciation for the complexity of those internal signals, and that they exist, and that food intake isn't entirely under our control, and that we're beginning to unpack the science of how those interactions work.
It's incredibly interesting. I agree with you on that. I have a slide that I bet I've shown 1,000 times in talks that I think Tony Sclafani gave me decades ago that shows laboratory rats standing in front of a pile of these supermarket foods And people would say, well, of course you're going to get overweight if that's all you eat. But animals would eat a healthy diet if they had access to it. But what they did was they had the pellets of the healthy rat chow sitting right in that pile. And the
Exactly.
animals ignore that and overeat the unhealthy food. And then you have this metabolic havoc occur. So it seems like the biology we've all inherited works pretty well if you have foods that we've inherited from the natural environment. But when things become pretty unnatural and we have all these concoctions of chemicals that comprise the modern food environment, the system really breaks down, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people are often swayed by the idea as well, those foods just taste better. And that might be part of it. But I think that what we've come to realize, even in our human experiments where we change people's food environments, not to the same extent that Tony Sclafani did with his rats, but for a month at a time where we ask people to not be trying to gain or lose weight, and we match certain food environments for various nutrients of concern, they overeat diets that are higher in these so-called ultra-processed foods, and they spontaneously lose weight when we remove those from the diet. And they're not saying that the foods are any more or less pleasant to eat. So there's this underlying sort of the liking of foods is somewhat separate from the wanting of foods, as neuroscientists are beginning to understand the different neural pathways that are involved in motivation and reward, as opposed to the sort of just the hedonic liking of foods. So even the simple explanation of, oh, yeah, the rats just like the food more, that doesn't seem to be fully explaining why we have these behaviors, why it's more complicated than a lot of people make out.
Let's talk about ultra processed foods. And boy, I've got two wonderful people to talk to about that topic. Julia, let's start with your opinion on this. So tell us about ultra processed foods and how much of the modern diet do they occupy?
So, ultra processed foods, obviously, there's an academic definition, and there's a lot of debate about defining this category of foods, including in the US by the Health Human Services. But the way I think about it is like these are foods that contain ingredients that you don't use in your home kitchen. They're typically cooked, concocted in factories, and they now make up, I think it's like 60% of the calories that are consumed in America and in other similar high-income countries. And a lot of these foods are what researchers would also call hyperpalatable. So they're crossing these pairs of nutrient thresholds like carbohydrate, salt, sugar, fat, these pairs that don't typically exist in nature. So for the reasons you were just discussing, they seem to be particularly alluring to people. They're again just like absolutely ubiquitous, and in these more developed contexts, like in the US and the UK in particular, they've displaced a lot of what we would think of as more traditional foodways or ways that people were eating. So that's sort of how I think about them.
If you go to a supermarket these days, it's pretty hard to find a part of the supermarket that doesn't have these foods. Whole entire aisles of processed cereals and candies and chips and soft drinks and
Yogurts,
frozen foods,
yeah.
yogurts. I mean, it's all over the place. And, given that if the average is 60% of calories, and there are plenty of people out there who aren't eating any of that stuff at all, for the other people who are, the number is way higher. And that, of course, is great concern. So there have been hundreds of studies now on ultra-processed foods. It was a concept born not that long ago, and there's been an explosion of science, and that's all for the good, I think, on these ultra-processed foods. And perhaps of all those studies, the one discussed most is one that you did, Kevin. And because it was exquisitely controlled and it also produced pretty striking findings. Would you describe that original study you did and what you found?
Yeah, sure. So the basic idea was one of the challenges that we have in nutrition science is accurately measuring how many calories people eat. And the best way to do that is to basically bring people into a laboratory and give them a test meal and measure how many calories they eat. Most studies of that sort last for maybe a day or two, but I always suspected that people could game the system. If for a day or two, it's probably not that hard to behave the way that the researcher wants or the subject wants to deceive the researcher. So we decided that what we wanted to do was bring people into the NIH Clinical Center, live with us for a month. And in two-week blocks, we decided that we would present them with two different food environments, essentially, that both provided double the number of calories that they would require to maintain their body weight. give them very simple instructions: eat as much or as little as you'd like. Don't be trying to change your weight. We're not going to tell you necessarily what the study's about. We're going to measure lots of different things. And they're blinded to their weight measurements, and they're wearing loose fitting scrubs and things like that. So they can't tell if their clothes are getting tighter or looser. And so what we did is, in a 1-2 week block, we presented people with the same number of calories, the same amount of sugar and fat and carbs and fiber. And we gave them a diet that was composed of 80% of calories coming from these ultra processed foods. In the other case, we gave them a diet that was composed of 0% of calories from ultra processed food and 80% of the so-called minimally processed food group. And what we then did was just measured people's leftovers, essentially. And I say we, it was really the chefs and the dietitians at the clinical center who were doing all the legwork on this. But what we found was pretty striking, which was that when people were exposed to this highly ultra-processed food environment, despite being matched for these various nutrients of concern, they overate calories, eating about 500 calories per day on average, more than the same people in the minimally processed diet condition. And they gained weight and gained body fat. And when they were in the minimally processed diet condition, they spontaneously lost weight and lost body fat without trying in either case, right? So they're just eating to the same level of hunger and fullness and overall appetite, and not reporting liking the meals any more or less in one diet versus the other. So something kind of more fundamental seemed to have been going on that we didn't fully understand at the time. What was it about these ultra processed foods? We were clearly getting rid of many of the things that promote their intake in the real world, which is, that they're convenient, they're cheap, they're easy to obtain, they're heavily marketed. None of that was at work here. It was something really about the meals themselves that we were providing to people. And so our subsequent research has been trying to figure out, okay, well, what were the properties of those meals that we were giving to these folks that were composed primarily of ultra processed foods that were driving people to consume excess calories?
I've presented your study a lot when I give talks, and so it's nice hearing it coming from you rather than me. But a couple of things that interest me here: you use people as their own controls. So each person had 2 weeks of one diet and 2 weeks of another. That's a pretty powerful way of providing experimental control. Could you say just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So, when you design a study, you're trying to maximize the efficiency of the study to get the answers that you want with the least number of participants, while still having good control and being able to design the study that's robust enough to detect a meaningful effect if it exists. And so one of the things that you do when you analyze studies like that or design studies like that, you could just randomize people to two different groups. But given how noisy and how different between people the measurement of food intake is, we would have required hundreds of people in each group to detect an effect like the one that we discovered using the same person acting as their own control. So we would still be doing the study 10 years later, as opposed to what we were able to do in this particular case, which is completed in a year or so for that first study. And so, yeah, when you kind of design a study that way, it's not always the case that you get that kind of improvement in statistical power. But for a measurement like food intake, it really is necessary to kind of do these sorts of crossover type studies where each person acts as their own control.
So put the 500 calorie increment in context. So using the old fashioned numbers, 3,500 calories equals a pound, that'd be about a pound a week, or a lot of pounds over a year. But of course, you don't know what would happen if people were followed chronically and all that. But still, 500 calories is a whopping increase, it seems to me.
It sure is. And there's no way that we would expect it to stay at that constant level for many, many weeks on end. And I think that's one of the key questions going forward is how persistent is that change, and how does something that we've known about and we discuss in our books, the basic physiology of how both energy expenditure changes as people gain and lose weight, as well as how does appetite change in a given environment when they gain and lose weight, and how do those two processes eventually equilibrate at a new sort of stable body weight, in this case, either higher or lower than when people started the program of this diet manipulation. And so it's really hard to make those kinds of extrapolations. And that's, of course, the need for further research where you have longer periods of time and you probably have an even better control over their food environment as a result.
I was surprised when I first read your study that you were able to detect a difference in percent body fat in such a short study. Did that surprise you as well?
Certainly, the study was not powered to detect body fat changes. In other words, we didn't know, even if there were real body fat changes, whether or not we would have the statistical capability to do that. We did use a method, DEXA, which is probably one of the most precise. And therefore, if we had a chance to measure it, we had the ability to detect it as opposed to other methods. There are other methods that are even more precise, but much more expensive. So, we thought that we had a chance to detect differences there. Other things that we used that we also didn't think that we necessarily would have a chance to detect were things like liver fat or something like that. Those have a much less of an ability. It's something that we're exploring now with the current study. But again, it's all exploratory at that point.
So what can you tell us about your current study?
Yeah, so we just wrapped it up, thankfully. What we were doing was basically re-engineering 2 new ultra-processed diets along parameters that we think are most likely the mechanisms by which ultra-processed meals drove increased energy intake in that study. One was the non-beverage energy density. So in other words, how many calories per gram of food on the plate, not counting the beverages. Something that we noticed in the first study was that ultra-processed foods, because they're essentially dried out in the processing for reasons of food safety to prevent bacterial growth and increase shelf life, they end up concentrating the foods. They're disrupting the natural food matrix. They last a lot longer, but as a result, they're more concentrated form of calories, despite being, by design, we chose the overall macronutrients to be the same. So they weren't necessarily higher fat, as we often think of as higher energy density. So what we did was we designed an ultra-processed diet that was low in energy density to kind of match the minimally processed diet. And then we also varied the number of individual foods that were deemed hyperpalatable, according to kind of what Julia said, that crossed these pairs of thresholds for fat and sugar, or fat and salt, or carbs and salt. And so what we noticed in the first study was that we presented people with more individual foods on the plate that had these hyperpalatable combinations. And I wrestled with the terminology a little bit because I don't necessarily think that they're working through the normal palatability that they necessarily like these foods anymore, because again, we asked people to rate the meals and they didn't report differences. But something about those combinations, regardless of what you call them, seemed to be driving that in our exploratory analysis of the first study. So we designed a diet that was high in energy density, but low in hyperpalatable foods, similar to the minimally processed. And then our fourth diet is with basically low in energy density and hyperpalatable foods. And so we presented some preliminary results last year. And what we were able to show is that when we reduced both energy density and the number of hyperpalatable foods, but still had 80% of calories from ultra-processed foods, that people more or less ate the same number of calories now as they did when the same people were exposed to the minimally processed diet. Mm-hmm. In fact, they lost weight to a similar extent as the minimally processed diet. And that suggests to me that we can really understand mechanisms, at least when it comes to calorie intake in these foods. And that might give regulators, policymakers, the sort of information that they need in order to target which ultra-processed foods and what contexts are they really problematic. It might give manufacturers, if they have the desire to kind of reformulate these foods, to understand which ones are more or less likely to cause overconsumption. So who knows? We'll see how people respond to that, and we'll see what the final results are with the entire study group that, like I said, just finished weeks ago.
I respond very positively to the idea of the study. The fact that, if people assume ultra-processed foods are bad actors, then trying to find out what it is about them that's making them bad actors becomes really important. And you're exactly right. There's a lot of pressure on the food companies now, some coming from public opinion, some coming from parts of the political world, some from the scientific world. And my guess is that litigation is going to become a real actor here too. And the question is, what do you want the food industry to do differently? And your study can really help inform that question. So incredibly valuable research. I can't wait to see the final study, and I'm really delighted that you did that. Let's turn our attention for a minute to food marketing. Julia, where does food marketing fit in all this?
So what I was very surprised to find while we were researching the book was that this deep, long history of calls against marketing junk food, in particular to kids. So I think from like the 1950s, you have pediatrician groups and other public health professionals saying, stop this. And anyone who has spent any time around small children knows that it works. We covered just like a little It was from an advocacy group in the UK that exposed 8 adolescents to something called triple dip chicken, and then asked them later, pick off of this menu. I think it was like 50 items, which food you want to order. And they all chose triple dip chicken, which as the name suggests, wasn't the healthiest thing to choose on the menu. I think we know, obviously, that it works. Companies invest a huge amount of money in marketing. It works even in ways like these subliminal ways that you can't fully appreciate to guide our food choices. Kevin raised something really interesting, was that in his studies, it was the foods. So it's a tricky one because it's the food environment, but it's also the properties of the foods themselves beyond just the marketing. Kevin, how do you think about that piece? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think that even if our first study and our second study had turned out, there's no real difference between these artificial environments that we've put together where highly ultra-processed diets lead to excess calorie intake. If that doesn't happen, if it was just the same, it wouldn't rule out the fact that because these foods are so heavily marketed, because they're so ubiquitous, they're cheap and convenient, and they're engineered for many people to incorporate into their day-to-day life, that could still promote overconsumption of calories. We just removed those aspects in our very artificial food environment. But of course, the real food environment, we're bombarded by these advertisements and the ubiquity of the food in every place that you sort of turn, and how they've displaced healthy alternatives, which is another mechanism by which they could cause harm, right? It doesn't even have to be the foods themselves that are harmful. What do they displace, right? We only have a certain amount of the marketers called stomach share, right? And so if, your harm might not be necessarily the foods that you're eating, but the foods that they displaced. So even if our experimental studies about the ultra-processed meals themselves didn't show excess calorie intake, which they clearly did, there's still all these other mechanisms to explore about how they might play a part in the real world.
The food industry will say that they're agnostic about what foods they sell. They just respond to demand. That seems utter nonsense to me because people don't overconsume healthy foods, but they do overconsume the unhealthy ones, and you've shown that to be the case. So it seems to me that idea that they can just switch from this portfolio of highly processed foods to more healthy foods just doesn't work out for them financially. Do you think that's right?
I honestly don't have that same sort of knee-jerk reaction, or at least I perceive it as a knee-jerk reaction, kind of attributing malice in some sense to the food industry. I think that they'd be equally happy if they could get you to buy a lot and have the same sort of profit margins, a lot of a group of foods that was just as cheap to produce and they could market. I think that you could kind of turn the levers in a way that would be beneficial. Setting aside, for example, that diet soda beverages are probably, from every randomized control trial that we've seen, they don't lead to the same amount of weight gain as the sugar sweetened alternatives. They're just as profitable to the beverage manufacturers. They sell just as many of them. Now, they might have other deleterious consequences, but I don't think that's necessarily the case that food manufacturers have to have these deleterious or unhealthy foods as their sole means of attaining profit.
Okay. So Julia, back to you. You and Kevin point out in your book some of the biggest myths about nutrition. What would you say some of them are?
I think one big fundamental overarching myth is this idea that the problem is in us. That this rise of diet-related diseases, this explosion that we've seen, is either because of, a lack of willpower, which you have some very elegant research on this that we cite in the book, showing willpower did not collapse in the last 30, 40 years of this epidemic of diet-related disease. But it's even broader than that. It's a slow metabolism. It's our genes. We put the problem on ourselves and we don't look at the way that the environment has changed enough. And I think as individuals, we don't do that. And so much of the messaging is about what, you, Kevin, or you, Kelly, or you, Julia, could be doing better, do resistance training. That's the big thing. If you open any social media feed, it's do more resistance training, eat more protein, cut out the ultra-processed foods. What about the food environment? What about the leaders that should be held accountable for helping to perpetuate these toxic food environments? I think that's this kind of overarching, this pegging it, and also the rise of personalized nutrition, this pegging it to individual biology instead of, for whatever the claim is, instead of thinking about how did environments and don't want to have as part of our lives. So that's kind of a big overarching thing that I
It
think
makes
about.
sense. So let's end on a positive note. There's a lot of reason to be concerned about the modern food environment. So, do you see a helpful way forward and what might be done about this? Julia, let's stay with you. What do you think?
I think so. So we spent a lot of time researching history for this book, and a lot of things that seem impossible are suddenly possible when you have, enough public demand and enough political will and pressure. There's so many instances, and even in the history of food, we spend time with this character, Harvey Wiley, who around the turn of the century, his research was one of the reasons we have something like the FDA protecting the food supply. So I think that gives me a lot of hope, and we are in this moment where a lot of awareness is being raised about the toxic food environment and all these negative attributes of food that people are surrounded by. And so I think with enough organization and enough pressure, we can see change, and we can see this kind of flip in the food environment that I think we all want to see, where healthier foods become more accessible, available, affordable, and the rest of it.
Sounds good. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just extend that to saying that for the first time in history, we sort of know what the population of the planet is going to be that we have to feed in the future. We're not under this sort of Malthusian threat of not being able to know where the population growth is going to go. We know it's going to be roughly 10 billion people within the next century. And we know we've got to change the way that we produce and grow food for the planet as well as for the health of people. And so we know we've got to make changes anyway. And we're starting from a position where per capita we're producing more protein and calories than any other time in human history, and we're wasting more food. So we actually know we're in a position of strength. We don't have to worry so acutely that we won't be able to provide enough food for everybody. It's what kind of food are we going to produce? How are we going to produce it in a way that's sustainable for both people and the planet? We have to tackle that anyway. And for the folks who had experienced the obesity epidemic, we finally have drugs to help them and other kinds of interventions to help them that absolve them from this idea that it's just a matter of weak willpower. We finally have some pharmaceutical interventions that are useful. So I do see a path forward. Whether or not we take that is another question.
Well, it's nice to hear an optimistic note, to think about what the future could bring. And boy, the two of you collaborated on a really wonderful book. So thanks so much for being with us. And thanks for sharing your thoughts to the world with this book. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much.
So our guests today have been journalist Julia Belluz and scientist Kevin Hall, authors of the new book entitled Food Intelligence. Thanks to our listeners for being with us. Special thanks to Deborah Hill for her wonderful work in producing this series. I'm Kelly Brownell.
Thank you for listening to the Leading Voices in Food podcast. This program is an educational series produced by Duke University's World Food Policy Center with the goal of promoting productive conversation for food systems change. If you would like to subscribe, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, or your favorite podcast app. Transcripts are also available on the website of the Duke World Food Policy Center.